Every morning you wake up and make breakfast. Coffee, cereal, maybe some toast. What you don't realize is that one family controls whether you can afford that breakfast at all. They don't own grocery stores. They don't run restaurants. They don't even grow food. But they control something far more powerful. The global supply chains that determine whether food gets from farms to your table and at what price. The Cargill family owns the largest private company in America. Not the largest food company, the largest company, period. With annual revenues exceeding $165 billion, they're bigger than Google, bigger than Microsoft, bigger than any company you can name except Walmart. Yet 99% of Americans have never heard of them. Here's what makes them truly dangerous. They control 25% of all American grain exports, 22% of meat production, and have operations in 70 countries that feed 3.8 billion people daily. When you buy bread, there's a 1 in 4 chance they controlled the wheat. When you eat meat, there's a 1 in 5 chance they processed it. When food prices spike globally, there's a near certainty they profited from it. But their real power isn't in what they produce, it's in what they know. The Cargill family has access to real-time data about crop yields, weather patterns, government policies, and market conditions from every major agricultural region on Earth. They know about food shortages before governments do. They know about price movements before markets do. Most importantly, they can cause both. The secret behind their control. They understood something about food that nobody else did in 1865. Whoever controls the flow of grain controls the flow of power. Food isn't just a commodity, it's a weapon. Starve a population and they'll accept any government. Control food prices and you control elections. Manipulate supply chains and you can topple entire economies. They've used this power to influence American foreign policy, determine which countries prosper or suffer, and accumulate wealth that exceeds the GDP of most nations. They've created artificial famines that killed millions while generating billions in profits. They've manipulated markets so effectively that they've been banned from entire continents. This is the story of how one family built an empire that feeds the world while holding it hostage. Accumulated power that exceeds most governments while remaining completely invisible, and created a monopoly so complete that breaking it might be impossible. Because when you control food, you don't just control markets, you control survival itself. Chapter 1. Hidden Empire. William Wallace Cargill understood something about America's future that most people missed in 1865. The Civil War had ended, railroads were expanding westward, farmers were cultivating vast new territories, but while others saw agricultural opportunity, Cargill saw something more valuable: the chance to control the infrastructure that would move America's grain to the world. At 21 years old, Cargill borrowed $3,000 to purchase a single grain elevator in Conover, Iowa. The elevator was a simple wooden structure that could store 10,000 bushels of corn, roughly enough to fill 2 modern railroad cars. But Cargill wasn't buying storage capacity. He was buying a position in what would become the most important supply chain in human history. Here's what made Cargill's strategy revolutionary. Instead of farming grain like his competitors, he focused on controlling grain after farmers grew it. Farmers needed storage during harvest season. They needed transportation to distant markets. Most importantly, they needed credit to survive the months between planting and selling. Cargill positioned himself as the essential middleman for all 3 services. His first innovation was creating standardized grading systems that enabled grain to be traded as a commodity rather than evaluated individually. Before Cargill, buyers had to inspect each farmer's grain personally, making large-scale trading impossible. Cargill developed classification systems based on moisture content, purity, and quality that enabled grain to be bought and sold sight unseen. This standardization was crucial for creating liquid markets where grain could be traded like stocks or bonds. Instead of negotiating individual contracts with hundreds of farmers, Cargill could purchase thousands of bushels based on standardized specifications. This efficiency enabled him to offer farmers better prices while still generating substantial profits. But standardization also created information advantages that Cargill leveraged ruthlessly. He knew which farms produced the highest quality grain, which regions had the best growing conditions, and which transportation routes offered the lowest costs. This information enabled him to buy grain at below market prices while selling it at premium rates in distant markets. By 1870, Cargill had expanded his operations to include 6 grain elevators across Iowa and Minnesota. But his real breakthrough came when he recognized that railroads were creating opportunities for unprecedented market manipulation. Grain prices varied dramatically between regions based on transportation costs and local supply conditions. Someone who could move grain efficiently between markets could generate enormous profits through arbitrage. Cargill's solution was building exclusive relationships with railroad companies that gave him preferential shipping rates and priority access to rail cars during peak seasons. These relationships weren't just business arrangements. They were strategic partnerships that enabled both parties to extract maximum profits from grain transportation. The railroad partnerships created powerful competitive advantages. Cargill could offer farmers higher prices because his transportation costs were lower. He could guarantee delivery schedules that independent grain traders couldn't match. Most importantly, he could manipulate supply flows between markets to optimize prices for his inventory. Emmanuel Cargill, William's younger brother, joined the business in 1872 and brought crucial financial expertise. While William focused on operations and relationships, Emmanuel developed sophisticated accounting systems that tracked costs, margins, and market opportunities across their expanding network of facilities. Emmanuel's innovation was treating grain storage and transportation as financial instruments rather than simple services. Instead of charging fixed fees for storage, they offered farmers complex contracts that included price guarantees, seasonal adjustments, and profit-sharing arrangements. These contracts transferred market risks from farmers to Cargill while creating recurring revenue streams that continued long after initial transactions. The brothers' integrated approach was remarkably sophisticated for its time. They weren't just buying and selling grain. They were creating a comprehensive ecosystem that controlled every aspect of grain marketing from farm to final consumer. Farmers became dependent on their storage services. Buyers relied on their quality guarantees. Transportation companies needed their shipping volumes. This dependency was exactly what the Cargill brothers intended. By making themselves indispensable to multiple parties, they could extract profits from every transaction while building barriers that prevented competitors from replicating their success. Their expansion strategy was aggressive and systematic. Between 1872 and 1875, they opened grain elevators in 12 additional locations across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and North Dakota. But they didn't just build facilities randomly. They carefully selected locations that would maximize their control over regional grain flows. Look at their Minnesota operations. Instead of competing directly with established grain dealers in Minneapolis, they built elevators in smaller towns that controlled grain flows into the city. This strategy enabled them to influence Minneapolis grain prices while avoiding direct confrontation with powerful local interests. William's political instincts were equally important. He cultivated relationships with state legislators who controlled railroad regulations, tax policies, and grain inspection standards. These relationships weren't just social, they were strategic investments that protected Cargill's competitive advantages while creating barriers for potential competitors. The brothers' most important innovation was developing futures contracts that enabled them to trade grain that hadn't been grown yet. Instead of waiting for harvest to begin trading activities, they could buy and sell next year's grain based on projected yields, weather forecasts, and market expectations. Futures trading was enormously risky because it required predicting agricultural outcomes months in advance, but it was also enormously profitable because it enabled Cargill to lock in favorable prices while farmers bore production risks. If crops failed, farmers suffered losses while Cargill's futures positions generated profits. By 1876, Cargill was trading grain futures worth more than $2 million annually, an enormous sum that exceeded the operating budgets of most state governments. They weren't just regional grain dealers anymore. They were becoming significant players in national commodity markets, but their rapid expansion was creating new vulnerabilities. The more they grew, the more capital they needed to finance inventory, facilities, and trading positions. Traditional banks were hesitant to lend money for agricultural speculation, forcing the brothers to seek alternative financing sources. Their solution was bringing in outside investors who provided capital in exchange for minority ownership stakes. But unlike modern venture capital arrangements, these investments came with minimal oversight requirements. Cargill maintained complete operational control while accessing capital necessary for continued expansion. The investor relationships established patterns of secrecy that would define Cargill's corporate culture for the next 150 years. Outside investors received financial returns, but no operational information about how profits were generated. They couldn't inspect facilities, review trading strategies, or question management decisions. This secrecy wasn't just about protecting competitive advantages, it was about hiding practices that might have been controversial if exposed to public scrutiny. Cargill was manipulating grain prices through their control of storage and transportation infrastructure. They were using political relationships to gain unfair advantages over competitors. They were employing trading strategies that transferred risks from themselves to farmers and consumers. Emmanuel's financial records from this period reveal the extraordinary profitability of their operations. Between 1873 and 1878, Cargill generated average annual profits exceeding 35% on invested capital, returns that were unprecedented in legitimate business activities. They were accumulating wealth at rates that rivaled the most successful speculators and industrialists of the Gilded Age. By 1880, the Cargill brothers controlled grain storage capacity, exceeding 500,000 bushels across 15 locations. They employed over 100 people and maintained trading relationships with buyers from New York to Liverpool. They had transformed from small-town grain dealers into regional powerhouses that influenced agricultural markets across the upper Midwest. But William Wallace Cargill had much larger ambitions. He understood that grain was becoming a global commodity that could generate profits far exceeding anything possible in domestic markets. American farmers were producing more grain than American consumers could eat. The surplus had to find markets somewhere, and whoever controlled those export channels would control enormous wealth. His next target was Minneapolis, which was emerging as America's flour milling capital. If Cargill could establish dominant positions in Minneapolis grain markets, they could influence flour prices nationwide while expanding into international trading opportunities. The brothers were ready for the next phase of empire building. They had proven that grain trading could generate extraordinary profits when conducted with sufficient scale, sophistication, and political protection. Now they needed to prove that these same principles could work on a national and eventually global scale. Their expansion into Minneapolis would test whether their small-town success could translate into big-city dominance. It would also reveal whether their secretive, manipulative business practices could survive in markets where competitors had similar resources and political connections. The stage was set for the next chapter, in what would become America's most powerful and least understood corporate dynasty. Chapter 2. Grain Kings, 1884. Minneapolis was experiencing the greatest boom in American agricultural history, and William Wallace Cargill was determined to control it. The city had become the flour milling capital of the world. Massive mills lined the Mississippi River, processing millions of bushels of wheat into flour that fed growing populations across America and Europe. Companies like Washburn Crosby, later General Mills, and Pillsbury were generating enormous profits by transforming Minnesota wheat into premium flour that commanded top prices in global markets. But Cargill understood that millers were only as powerful as their grain supply allowed. No matter how efficient their mills or sophisticated their marketing, flour companies needed reliable access to high-quality wheat at competitive prices. Whoever controlled that wheat supply would ultimately control the entire flour industry. His strategy was audacious. Instead of competing directly with established millers, Cargill would control the grain flows that fed their operations. He would build storage facilities, transportation networks, and trading relationships that made flour millers dependent on his services while generating profits from every bushel they processed. The first phase involved purchasing strategic grain elevators that controlled wheat flows into Minneapolis. Instead of building new facilities, that would take years to become profitable, Cargill acquired existing elevators from owners who lacked capital for expansion or sophistication for large-scale trading operations. These acquisitions weren't hostile takeovers. They were carefully negotiated partnerships that provided former owners with immediate cash while giving Cargill operational control. This approach enabled rapid expansion without triggering competitive responses from major millers who might have blocked new construction projects. Emmanuel Cargill's financial analysis revealed the genius of this strategy. Purchasing existing elevators cost approximately 60% less than building equivalent new facilities. More importantly, acquired elevators came with established farmer relationships and transportation contracts that would have taken years to develop independently. By 1886, Cargill owned or controlled 16 grain elevators in Minneapolis and surrounding areas. Their combined storage capacity exceeded 1.2 million bushels, enough grain to supply major mills for several weeks during peak demand periods. But capacity wasn't their real advantage. Position was. Williams' elevator network was positioned to capture grain flows before they reached competitors. Farmers who had traditionally sold directly to millers now found it more convenient and profitable to sell to Cargill elevators. This shift gave Cargill information about grain supplies weeks before millers knew what they would pay for raw materials. Information advantages enabled market manipulation that was both legal and enormously profitable. When Cargill's network indicated that grain supplies would be tight, they could purchase additional inventory before prices rose. When supplies appeared abundant, they could reduce inventory before prices fell. They were essentially trading on inside information that their infrastructure provided. The millers initially welcomed Cargill's expansion because it seemed to increase competition among grain suppliers, potentially reducing their raw material costs. They didn't realize that Cargill was systematically gaining control over grain supplies that would eventually enable them to dictate prices rather than respond to market forces. Cargill's breakthrough innovation was creating basis trading systems that separated grain prices from transportation costs. Instead of quoting farmers single prices that included delivery to mills, Cargill offered base prices plus separate transportation fees that varied based on destination and timing. This pricing structure seemed transparent, but it actually enabled sophisticated manipulation. Cargill could adjust transportation fees to encourage farmers to deliver grain during periods when storage was advantageous. They could vary destination premiums to influence grain flows between competing mills. Most importantly, they could create artificial price differences that generated trading profits without adding economic value. John Cargill Sr., William's eldest son, joined the business in 1887 and brought engineering expertise that revolutionized their operations. While his father and uncle focused on trading and finance, John concentrated on improving the physical infrastructure that moved and stored grain. John's innovations included mechanized grain handling systems that reduced labor costs while increasing processing speeds. Traditional grain elevators required dozens of workers to move grain manually using buckets and pulleys. John's mechanized systems used conveyors, pneumatic tubes, and automated sorting equipment that could process the same volumes with 75% fewer workers. These efficiency improvements enabled Cargill to offer farmers better prices while maintaining higher profit margins. But more importantly, they created barriers to entry that prevented smaller competitors from matching their cost advantages. The capital investments required for mechanized systems exceeded what most regional grain dealers could afford. The technology advantages also enabled new forms of market manipulation. Automated systems provided real-time data about grain quality, moisture content, and storage conditions that enabled more sophisticated trading strategies. Cargill could identify grade discrepancies that created arbitrage opportunities while avoiding inventory risks that might destroy competitors. By 1888, Cargill's Minneapolis operations were generating over $8 million in annual revenues, an enormous sum that exceeded the total budgets of many state governments. Their profit margins approached 25% during favorable market conditions, providing cash flows that funded continued expansion into new regions and business lines. But success was creating powerful enemies. Major flour millers were becoming concerned about Cargill's growing influence over grain supplies. Railroad companies were questioning whether Cargill's preferential shipping arrangements were fair to other customers. Most importantly, farmers were beginning to organize cooperatives that challenged Cargill's control over grain marketing. The Grange movement represented the most serious threat to Cargill's business model. Farmers' cooperatives were attempting to eliminate middlemen by building their own storage facilities and marketing grain directly to mills. If successful, these cooperatives could reduce Cargill's market share while forcing down the margins they earned on grain transactions. William Cargill's response was characteristically ruthless. Instead of competing on price or service quality, he used political influence to create regulatory barriers that made farmer cooperatives difficult to organize and operate. He lobbied for grain inspection standards that required expensive equipment that cooperatives couldn't afford. He supported transportation regulations that favored large shippers over small cooperative groups. More directly, Cargill used their financial resources to undermine cooperative efforts. When farmers attempted to build competing elevators, Cargill would temporarily reduce grain prices in those markets until the projects became financially unsustainable. When cooperatives needed credit for operations, Cargill's banking relationships ensured that loans were difficult to obtain. These tactics were effective but dangerous. They generated lasting hostility from farming communities that viewed Cargill as exploitative middlemen who extracted profits without adding value. This hostility would eventually lead to political pressures for agricultural regulation that constrained Cargill's operations. John Cargill Sr.'s strategic insight was recognizing that Cargill needed to expand beyond grain trading into businesses that were less vulnerable to political attack. Grain storage and transportation were essential services that farmers needed, regardless of their political preferences. If Cargill could make these services indispensable while maintaining grain trading operations, they would be less vulnerable to cooperative competition. This insight led to massive investments in infrastructure that extended Cargill's control over agricultural supply chains. They built additional elevators, purchased railroad cars and barges, and acquired processing facilities that enabled them to add value to grain rather than simply trading it. The infrastructure expansion required enormous capital investments that strained even Cargill's substantial resources. Emmanuel Cargill arranged financing through Eastern banks and European investors who were eager to participate in American agricultural expansion. But these financing arrangements came with requirements for financial reporting that conflicted with Cargill's preferences for secrecy. The tension between capital needs and secrecy preferences would shape Cargill's corporate structure for the next century. They needed outside capital to fund growth, but they wanted to maintain family control over operations and strategy. The solution was creating complex ownership structures that provided investors with financial returns while preserving family management authority. By 1890, Cargill had become the largest grain trader in the upper Midwest, with storage capacity exceeding 2 million bushels and trading relationships that extended from North Dakota to Liverpool. They employed over 300 people and generated profits that placed the Cargill family among the wealthiest in America. But William Wallace Cargill wasn't satisfied with regional dominance. He understood that American agriculture was becoming increasingly integrated with global markets as transportation costs declined and international trade expanded. The company that could master international grain trading would accumulate wealth and power that exceeded anything possible in domestic markets alone. His next target was gaining access to export terminals that could ship American grain to Europe, Asia, and other growing markets. This expansion would require different skills, larger capital investments, and more sophisticated political relationships than anything Cargill had attempted previously. Look at what they had accomplished in just 25 years. A $3,000 investment in a single grain elevator had grown into a multi-million-dollar enterprise that influenced agricultural markets across multiple states. They had proven that controlling infrastructure was more profitable than owning production, that information could be more valuable than inventory, and that political relationships were essential for sustained business success. But their success was also creating vulnerabilities. The larger they became, the more attention they attracted from regulators, competitors, and critics who questioned whether their market power was consistent with democratic capitalism. They were approaching the size where continued growth would require either accepting public oversight or finding ways to expand while maintaining secrecy. The Cargill family chose secrecy, setting the stage for conflicts with public authorities that would define their operations for the next century. Chapter 3. Trading Secrets, 1893. The worst economic panic in American history was destroying businesses across the country. Banks failed, railroads went bankrupt, millions lost their jobs. But in Minneapolis, William Wallace Cargill was quietly accumulating more grain elevators at fire sale prices while his competitors collapsed. The Panic of 1893 revealed the genius of Cargill's business model. While other companies depended on credit markets that vanished during financial crises, Cargill generated cash flows from essential services that people needed regardless of economic conditions. Farmers still had to store grain. Millers still needed raw materials. Grain still had to move from farms to consumers. More importantly, financial panics created opportunities for companies with strong balance sheets to acquire assets from distressed sellers at dramatically reduced prices. Cargill used cash accumulated during prosperous years to purchase competing grain elevators, railroad equipment, and processing facilities that would have cost 3 times as much during normal market conditions. But Cargill's real advantage during the crisis wasn't financial, it was informational. Their network of grain elevators and trading relationships provided real-time intelligence about economic conditions that banks and government officials lacked. They knew which farms were struggling before foreclosures began. They understood which regions would experience food shortages before prices spiked. They could predict transportation bottlenecks before supply chains collapsed. This information enabled trading strategies that generated enormous profits while seeming to provide public services. When Cargill's intelligence indicated that grain shortages would develop in certain regions, they could pre-position inventory to meet demand at premium prices. When oversupply threatened other areas, they could arrange transportation to move grain to higher value markets. Immanuel Cargill's private correspondence from this period reveals the calculated nature of their crisis response. In a letter to European investors, he wrote, "While others see disaster, we see opportunity. Economic panics separate efficient operators from speculators. Our storage and transportation infrastructure becomes more valuable when credit markets fail because physical assets provide security that financial instruments cannot match." The family's expansion strategy during the 1890s depression was both opportunistic and systematic. They identified grain facilities owned by companies facing bankruptcy, conducted detailed financial analysis to determine minimum acquisition prices, then waited for optimal timing to make offers that stressed sellers couldn't refuse. Consider their acquisition of the Minnesota Grain Company in 1894. MGC owned 7 elevators and controlled approximately 15% of Minneapolis grain storage capacity. During prosperous times, the company might have been worth $800,000. But financial distress forced a sale at $280,000, less than the replacement cost of the facilities alone. This acquisition provided Cargill with dominant market share in Minneapolis, while eliminating a significant competitor. But more importantly, it gave them access to MGC's trading relationships with European buyers who were seeking reliable American grain suppliers during a period when many exporters were failing. John Cargill Sr.'s role became crucial during this expansion phase. While his father focused on acquisitions and political relationships, John concentrated on integrating newly acquired facilities into Cargill's operational systems. This integration was complex because each acquired company had different equipment, procedures, and employee cultures. John's solution was developing standardized operating procedures that could be implemented across all Cargill facilities, regardless of their origins. These standards covered everything from grain grading to customer service to financial reporting. The standardization enabled efficient management of increasingly complex operations while ensuring consistent quality across their expanding network. But standardization also served more subtle purposes. Uniform procedures made it difficult for employees to detect regional price manipulations or preferential treatment for certain customers. Standardized reporting systems enabled central management to track information flows while limiting local managers' understanding of overall strategy. The centralized information systems that John implemented became crucial for Cargill's market manipulation capabilities. Local managers reported detailed data about grain flows, customer relationships, and competitive activities to Minneapolis headquarters. This intelligence was aggregated into market analyses that informed trading decisions across their entire network. William Wallace Cargill's political sophistication increased dramatically during the 1890s as the company's size and influence attracted regulatory attention. Populist politicians were demanding investigations of grain trading companies that they blamed for high food prices and farmer exploitation. Cargill needed political protection to continue their expansion and maintain their market advantages. These lobbying efforts weren't just defensive, they were designed to create regulatory frameworks that favored large grain companies over smaller competitors. Complex grain inspection standards, transportation regulations, and financial reporting requirements created barriers to entry that protected Cargill's market position while appearing to serve public interests. The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 provided an example of how Cargill leveraged regulation for competitive advantage. The act was supposed to prevent railroad discrimination and ensure fair shipping rates for all customers. But Cargill's lobbyists helped write implementation rules that actually protected their preferential shipping arrangements, while making it more difficult for smaller companies to negotiate favorable transportation contracts. By 1895, Cargill's political influence extended beyond agricultural policy into broader economic legislation. They maintained relationships with Treasury Department officials who controlled currency policy that affected grain export competitiveness. They funded congressional campaigns for politicians who supported free trade policies that opened new markets for American agricultural products. The company's international expansion began during the mid-1890s as European demand for American grain increased due to crop failures and population growth. But international trading required different skills and capabilities than domestic operations. Foreign buyers demanded different grain varieties, quality specifications, and contract terms than American customers. Emmanuel Cargill's solution was establishing trading offices in Liverpool and Hamburg that could serve European markets while maintaining operational control from Minneapolis. These offices weren't autonomous subsidiaries. They were extensions of Cargill's centralized trading operations that enabled real-time coordination between American supply and European demand. The international offices also provided intelligence about global agricultural conditions that enhanced Cargill's trading capabilities. European representatives reported on crop conditions, government policies, and competitive activities that affected global grain prices. This information enabled Cargill to anticipate market movements that domestic competitors couldn't predict. But international operations also exposed Cargill to new risks, including currency fluctuations, political instability, and foreign regulations. European governments were more aggressive than American authorities about investigating grain companies for market manipulation and anti-competitive practices. Cargill needed to adapt their strategies to operate in regulatory environments that were less friendly to large corporate interests. The family's response was developing more sophisticated methods for concealing their market influence while maintaining operational effectiveness. Instead of directly controlling grain flows through ownership, they created complex contractual relationships that achieved similar results through seemingly independent intermediaries. For example, rather than owning grain elevators in Germany, Cargill would finance local operators who agreed to exclusive dealing arrangements. These arrangements gave Cargill control over grain flows without triggering foreign ownership restrictions that might have limited their activities. By 1900, Cargill was trading grain worth over $25 million annually across domestic and international markets. Their storage capacity exceeded 3 million bushels, distributed across 37 facilities in 6 states. They employed over 500 people and maintained trading relationships with buyers in 12 countries. But their rapid growth was creating internal management challenges that threatened operational efficiency. Coordinating activities across multiple states and countries required communication systems and management structures that didn't exist when Cargill was primarily a regional grain dealer. John Cargill Sr.'s management innovations addressed these challenges through organizational systems that would later be adopted by many large corporations. He created divisional structures that gave regional managers authority over local operations while maintaining central control over strategy and major transactions. He implemented standardized reporting systems that enabled headquarters to monitor performance across all divisions. Most importantly, he developed management training programs that ensured local managers understood and implemented corporate policies consistently regardless of their geographic locations. These training programs also served indoctrination purposes, instilling company loyalty and cultural values that reduced the risks of employees revealing confidential information to competitors or regulators. The training programs emphasized the importance of discretion about Cargill's trading strategies and market activities. Employees were taught that competitive advantages depended on maintaining secrecy about operations that competitors might copy if they understood them fully. This culture of secrecy became deeply embedded in Cargill's corporate identity and continues influencing their practices today. Look, what the Cargill family had accomplished by 1900 was extraordinary by any measure. They had grown from a single grain elevator into a multinational trading operation that influenced agricultural markets across 2 continents. They had survived major economic crises while expanding their market share and accumulating enormous wealth. But their success was based on methods that would be controversial if fully understood by the farmers, consumers, and government officials who were affected by their activities. They were using information advantages to manipulate markets, political influence to shape regulations, and financial resources to eliminate competitors. The 20th century would test whether these methods could continue generating profits as government oversight increased. International markets became more competitive, and public awareness of corporate power grew. The Cargill family would need to become even more sophisticated about concealing their influence while expanding their control over global food systems. Their next challenge was adapting to an era when secrecy would become more difficult, but even more essential for continued success. Chapter 4. Global Expansion. World War I was devastating European agriculture, and William Wallace Cargill saw the greatest opportunity in his company's 50-year history. Allied forces needed massive quantities of American grain to feed their armies and civilian populations. European farms were being destroyed by military operations. Shipping routes were disrupted by submarine warfare. Most importantly, desperate governments were willing to pay almost any price for reliable food supplies. But this opportunity came with unprecedented risks. Trading with belligerent nations during wartime meant navigating complex regulations, currency controls, and political pressures that could destroy companies that made wrong decisions. European buyers might default on contracts if their governments collapsed. German submarines were sinking merchant ships carrying American grain to Allied ports. Cargill's response revealed the sophisticated risk management capabilities they had developed over 5 decades. Instead of simply increasing grain exports through existing channels, they created complex trading structures that distributed risks while maximizing profits from wartime demand. John Cargill Sr., who had assumed operational leadership after his father's death in 1909, understood that wartime grain trading required government support to manage political and financial risks. But government contracts came with oversight requirements that conflicted with Cargill's traditional secrecy preferences. His solution was developing relationships with intelligence agencies and military officials who needed reliable suppliers for overseas operations. These relationships provided Cargill with classified information about military planning, shipping schedules, and enemy activities that enabled more effective trading strategies. The intelligence relationships weren't just about gaining information, they were about gaining protection. Companies that served essential military functions received government assistance with transportation, financing, and risk management that wasn't available to purely commercial operators. Cargill positioned themselves as indispensable to American war efforts while generating enormous profits from military contracts. Consider their grain supply contracts with the American Expeditionary Forces in France. The military needed approximately 100,000 tons of grain monthly to feed troops and support civilian populations in liberated areas. Traditional procurement methods couldn't guarantee reliable delivery under wartime conditions because European infrastructure was constantly being disrupted by military operations. Cargill proposed an integrated solution that combined grain supply, transportation, and storage services under single contracts that guaranteed delivery regardless of operational difficulties. This approach required enormous resources and sophisticated logistics capabilities that few companies could provide, but it also generated profit margins that exceeded anything possible during peacetime. The military contracts enabled Cargill to justify massive infrastructure investments that would benefit their commercial operations for decades. They built grain terminals at East Coast ports, purchased ocean-going vessels, and established warehouses in Europe that provided permanent platforms for international expansion. But their most important wartime innovation was developing financial instruments that enabled trading, despite currency instability and credit disruptions. Traditional commercial letters of credit weren't viable when European banks faced potential bankruptcy, and currencies fluctuated wildly based on military developments. Emmanuel Cargill, now serving as the company's chief financial officer, created commodity-backed securities that used grain inventory as collateral for international transactions. These instruments enabled buyers to purchase American grain using their own agricultural products or industrial materials as payment, reducing currency risks while opening new trading opportunities. The commodity-backed securities were remarkably sophisticated for their time. Modern derivatives markets use similar principles to manage currency and commodity risks in international transactions. Cargill had essentially invented structured finance decades before Wall Street developed similar capabilities. Their wartime profits were extraordinary, even by Cargill standards. Between 1914 and 1918, the company's annual revenues increased from $35 million to over $180 million. Profit margins approached 40% on military contracts, while averaging 25% on commercial transactions. The Cargill family accumulated wealth that placed them among America's richest dynasties. But success was creating new challenges that would test their management capabilities. Coordinating grain flows across multiple continents required communication systems that didn't exist and logistics capabilities that exceeded most corporations' competencies. Managing relationships with dozens of governments, military organizations, and commercial partners required diplomatic skills that went far beyond traditional business expertise. John Hugh Macmillan, who married John Cargill Sr.'s daughter and joined the company in 1915, brought exactly the capabilities needed for this expanded scope. Macmillan had studied international law and spoke several European languages. More importantly, he understood how to build systematic relationships with foreign government officials and business leaders. Macmillan's contribution was developing what would become Cargill's signature approach to international expansion: deep integration with local political and business establishments that provided protection and market access while maintaining operational control from American headquarters. This approach required patient relationship building that could take years to generate profits. Macmillan would spend months in foreign countries, learning local customs, building personal relationships, and understanding regulatory environments before establishing formal business operations. But these investments created sustainable competitive advantages that enabled Cargill to dominate markets for decades. The post-war period tested whether Cargill's wartime expansion could survive the return to normal commercial conditions. European agriculture recovered gradually, reducing demand for American grain exports. Military contracts ended abruptly, eliminating major revenue sources. Most importantly, government officials who had supported Cargill during wartime were replaced by politicians who questioned whether such large private companies served public interests. Cargill's response was diversifying into new business lines that reduced their dependence on grain trading while leveraging their existing capabilities. They expanded into vegetable oil processing, animal feed production, and industrial chemicals that used agricultural raw materials. These businesses provided more stable revenue streams while creating additional markets for grain products. The diversification strategy was carefully planned to maintain Cargill's essential position in agricultural supply chains while reducing political vulnerabilities. Instead of just trading grain, they were processing grain into higher-value products that served industrial customers. Instead of just storing grain, they were manufacturing products that required their storage and transportation infrastructure. But their most important post-war innovation was expanding into South America, where agricultural development was accelerating and competition from established companies was minimal. Argentina and Brazil had vast agricultural potential, but lacked the infrastructure and expertise needed for large-scale grain production and export. Macmillan's analysis identified exactly the opportunity that had made Cargill successful in America: the chance to control infrastructure development in emerging agricultural regions. South American farmers needed storage facilities, transportation networks, and market access that only international companies could provide efficiently. Cargill's South American expansion began with joint ventures that paired their technical expertise with local political connections. They partnered with prominent families who owned large agricultural estates and maintained relationships with government officials who controlled land use and export policies. These partnerships enabled rapid market penetration while avoiding political risks that might have threatened purely foreign operations. Local partners provided regulatory protection, while Cargill provided capital and technical capabilities that created sustainable competitive advantages. By 1925, Cargill operated grain elevators and processing facilities in Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. Their South American operations generated over $50 million in annual revenues, while providing diversified geographic exposure that reduced their dependence on American agricultural conditions. The international expansion also provided new opportunities for the sophisticated trading strategies that had made Cargill successful in domestic markets. Different growing seasons between North and South America enabled year-round grain trading that took advantage of seasonal price variations. Currency differences between countries created arbitrage opportunities that generated profits without commodity risks. Most importantly, Cargill's global operations provided information advantages that no purely domestic competitor could match. They knew about crop conditions, weather patterns, and government policies across multiple continents months before this information became available to other market participants. John Cargill Sr.'s death in 1918 had transferred leadership to John Hugh Macmillan, who proved even more ambitious and sophisticated than his predecessors. While earlier generations had focused on dominating American grain markets, Macmillan envisioned global operations that would control agricultural trade across multiple continents. His strategic vision was remarkably prescient. Macmillan understood that agricultural production would become increasingly global as transportation costs declined and population growth created demand that exceeded regional supply capabilities. The company that could coordinate production and distribution across continents would accumulate power that exceeded most national governments. By 1930, Cargill employed over 3,000 people across 4 continents and generated annual revenues exceeding $400 million. They controlled grain storage capacity of over 15 million bushels and maintained trading relationships with buyers in 37 countries. The small grain elevator that William Wallace Cargill had purchased for $3,000 had grown into one of the world's largest private corporations. But their expansion was creating new vulnerabilities that would be tested by the greatest economic crisis in modern history. The Great Depression would challenge whether Cargill's global operations could survive worldwide economic collapse while maintaining the family control that had defined their corporate culture since 1865. Look, what they had achieved by 1930 was unprecedented in agricultural history. They had created the first truly global food trading company while maintaining private ownership and operational secrecy. They had proven that American agricultural expertise could be leveraged for international expansion that generated extraordinary returns. Their success had established patterns that would influence global food systems for the next century. Vertical integration that controlled multiple supply chain stages, political relationships that provided regulatory protection, and information networks that enabled market manipulation on an international scale. The next phase would test whether these strategies could survive the political and economic challenges of the mid-20th century. Chapter 5. Market Control, 1932. The Great Depression was destroying American agriculture. Corn prices had fallen 75%. Wheat was selling for less than it cost to grow. Thousands of farms were being foreclosed. But at Cargill headquarters in Minneapolis, John Hugh McMillan was quietly implementing the most aggressive expansion strategy in the company's history. While competitors struggled to survive, Cargill was using their accumulated cash reserves to purchase distressed agricultural assets at historically low prices. They acquired grain elevators, processing facilities, and transportation equipment from bankrupt companies that had no choice but to accept whatever offers they received. But McMillan's strategy went far beyond opportunistic asset purchases. He understood that the Depression was fundamentally restructuring American agriculture in ways that would create permanent advantages for large, well-capitalized companies like Cargill. Small farms were failing and being consolidated into larger operations. Independent grain dealers were disappearing. Traditional agricultural financing was collapsing. This consolidation was exactly what Cargill needed to achieve the market dominance that had previously been impossible due to the fragmented nature of American agriculture. The Depression was eliminating thousands of small competitors while creating opportunities for systematic control over agricultural supply chains. McMillan's analysis of agricultural economics during the Depression revealed insights that would guide Cargill's strategy for decades. He recognized that food demand was inelastic. People had to eat regardless of economic conditions, which meant that companies controlling food distribution could maintain profitability even during severe downturns. More importantly, he understood that agricultural crises created political opportunities for companies that positioned themselves as essential to food security. Governments desperate to ensure adequate food supplies would provide support and protection to companies that guaranteed reliable distribution systems. The Roosevelt administration's New Deal agricultural programs provided exactly the political framework that McMillan had anticipated. Federal crop support programs, agricultural financing initiatives, and food distribution systems all required private sector partnerships with companies that had necessary expertise and infrastructure. Cargill positioned themselves as the logical partner for government agricultural programs while carefully avoiding regulatory oversight that might limit their operational flexibility. They provided services to federal agencies while maintaining private control over their most sensitive trading and pricing activities. Consider their relationship with the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, AAA, which was created to stabilize farm incomes through crop reduction programs and price supports. The AAA needed companies that could store surplus agricultural products, process them into industrial uses, and distribute them through existing commercial channels. Cargill's response was developing government services divisions that seemed to serve public purposes while advancing their private interests. They stored government surplus grain in their elevators, processed it in their facilities, and distributed it through their networks. These services generated substantial fees while increasing their control over agricultural supplies. But their real breakthrough was gaining access to government data about crop conditions, farming intentions, and program participation that provided enormous advantages for their commercial trading activities. Agricultural programs required detailed reporting from farmers about their planting plans, expected yields, and storage arrangements. This information was invaluable for commodity trading because it enabled more accurate forecasting of supply and demand conditions than any private company could develop independently. Cargill's government relationships provided access to data that was essentially insider information for agricultural markets. McMillan's political sophistication enabled these arrangements while maintaining plausible deniability about their market implications. He cultivated relationships with agricultural officials who genuinely believed that private sector partnerships served public interests. These officials saw Cargill as efficient service providers rather than market manipulators seeking unfair advantages. The company's expansion during the 1930s was systematic and comprehensive. They acquired competitors, expanded processing capabilities, and established operations in new geographic regions while carefully maintaining the family ownership structure that preserved their operational secrecy. Their most important acquisition was the Nunn-Bush Grain Company, which controlled significant market share in Chicago grain trading. Chicago was America's most important commodity market, and establishing dominant positions there would enable Cargill to influence pricing for agricultural products nationwide. The Nunn-Bush acquisition cost $12 million, an enormous sum during the Depression, but it provided Cargill with trading capabilities that no competitor could match. They could now coordinate grain flows between Minneapolis and Chicago while maintaining storage and processing facilities in both markets. More importantly, the Chicago operations provided access to commodity futures markets that enabled more sophisticated trading strategies. Cargill could hedge their inventory risks while taking speculative positions based on their superior information about supply and demand conditions. William Cargill, John Hugh Macmillan's brother-in-law and heir to the founder's legacy, focused on developing technological capabilities that would maintain Cargill's competitive advantages as agriculture became more mechanized and scientific. His innovations included automated grain handling systems, scientific storage techniques, and quality control procedures that enabled Cargill to offer superior services while reducing operational costs. These technological advantages created barriers to entry that protected their market position while improving profit margins. But technology also enabled new forms of market manipulation that were more difficult for regulators to detect and prove. Automated systems could execute complex trading strategies that appeared to be responses to market conditions rather than attempts to influence prices artificially. Consider their grain storage operations during the mid-1930s drought that devastated American agriculture. Cargill's storage facilities enabled them to accumulate grain inventory during normal harvest periods, then release supplies gradually during shortages to maximize prices while avoiding accusations of hoarding. Their storage strategy was coordinated across multiple regions to create artificial scarcity in some markets while maintaining adequate supplies in others. This geographic arbitrage generated enormous profits while appearing to serve legitimate commercial purposes. The drought also demonstrated Cargill's ability to leverage natural disasters for competitive advantage. While independent grain dealers struggled with storage limitations and financing difficulties, Cargill had sufficient resources to maintain operations and capture market share from distressed competitors. Their market power was becoming so comprehensive that they could influence agricultural prices through their operational decisions rather than traditional trading activities. When Cargill adjusted their purchasing patterns, storage policies, or distribution schedules, the effects rippled through entire regional markets. By 1940, Cargill controlled approximately 20% of American grain storage capacity and maintained significant market share in grain trading, oilseed processing, and agricultural financing. Their annual revenues exceeded $200 million while employing over 8,000 people across multiple business lines. But their market dominance was attracting regulatory attention from antitrust authorities, who questioned whether any private company should control such large portions of essential food systems. The Justice Department was investigating agricultural markets for evidence of monopolistic practices that violated federal competition laws. Macmillan's response was developing legal and political strategies that would protect Cargill from antitrust enforcement while maintaining their market advantages. He hired prominent attorneys who specialized in antitrust defense and cultivated relationships with political leaders who supported private enterprise over government intervention. More importantly, he restructured Cargill's operations to make antitrust prosecution more difficult. Instead of directly controlling agricultural markets through ownership, they created contractual relationships and financial arrangements that achieved similar results through seemingly independent intermediaries. For example, rather than owning all grain elevators in a region, Cargill would finance independent operators who agreed to exclusive dealing arrangements. These arrangements gave Cargill control over grain flows without creating the direct ownership patterns that typically triggered antitrust investigations. The restructuring strategies were remarkably sophisticated and would be adopted by many other large corporations, facing similar regulatory pressures. Cargill was pioneering legal techniques for maintaining market control while avoiding antitrust liability that continue being used by dominant companies today. Their international operations provided additional protection from domestic antitrust enforcement because they could relocate sensitive activities to countries with less aggressive competition policies. European and South American operations enabled continued growth even if American regulators limited their domestic expansion. By 1941, Cargill had proven that private companies could achieve quasi-governmental power over essential industries without triggering effective regulatory responses. They controlled market share comparable to public utilities while maintaining private ownership and minimal oversight. The World War II mobilization would provide new opportunities for expansion that would test whether their market power could be leveraged for even greater control over global food systems. The war effort would require unprecedented coordination between private companies and government agencies that could either expose Cargill's market manipulation or provide new mechanisms for expanding their influence. Look, what Cargill had accomplished by 1941 was historically unprecedented. They had created market dominance over essential food systems while maintaining private ownership and operational secrecy. They had survived major economic crises and regulatory challenges while continuously expanding their market power and geographic reach. Their success had established business models and political relationships that would influence global agricultural markets for the remainder of the 20th century. They had proven that with sufficient resources, sophistication, and political protection, private companies could achieve control over essential public functions without accepting public accountability. The next phase would test whether these capabilities could be leveraged for global expansion that would make Cargill one of the most powerful institutions on Earth. Chapter 6: Political Power. World War II had ended, and Cargill emerged from the conflict as the most powerful private company in global agriculture. Their wartime revenues had exceeded $1.2 billion annually, making them larger than most government agencies. More importantly, they had developed relationships with military and intelligence officials that would provide political protection and market advantages for decades. John Hugh Macmillan Jr., who assumed leadership after his father's death in 1944, understood that Cargill's post-war success would depend on their ability to influence American foreign policy in ways that opened new markets while protecting their existing operations from international competition and domestic regulation. His strategy was ambitious and sophisticated. Cargill would position themselves as essential to American Cold War strategy by providing intelligence about global agricultural conditions, expertise about food security issues, and capabilities for delivering humanitarian assistance that served broader geopolitical objectives. The Central Intelligence Agency, established in 1947, needed information about global food production and distribution systems that could affect political stability in strategically important regions. Agricultural intelligence was crucial for predicting political unrest, economic crises, and military vulnerabilities that might influence American foreign policy decisions. Cargill's global operations provided exactly the intelligence capabilities that the CIA required. Their trading networks reached into virtually every major agricultural region, providing real-time information about crop conditions, food supplies, and economic trends that government agencies couldn't collect independently. The intelligence relationship wasn't just informal cooperation. It was systematic collaboration that provided Cargill with classified information about American foreign policy while giving government agencies access to Cargill's private intelligence networks. This arrangement served both parties' interests while creating powerful barriers against regulatory interference. Consider their operations in Eastern Europe during the early Cold War. The Soviet Union was experiencing severe agricultural difficulties that threatened their ability to feed urban populations and maintain military forces. American intelligence agencies needed detailed information about Soviet food systems that could inform diplomatic and military strategies. Cargill's European trading operations provided exactly the intelligence that government agencies required. Their representatives maintained relationships with agricultural officials in communist countries who provided information about crop yields, storage conditions, and distribution problems that revealed the scope of Soviet agricultural weaknesses. This intelligence enabled American policymakers to leverage food exports as diplomatic tools while helping Cargill negotiate advantageous trading arrangements with communist governments desperate for agricultural assistance. Cargill could sell grain to Soviet allies at premium prices, while providing American officials with leverage for broader geopolitical negotiations. But their most important political breakthrough was gaining influence over American food assistance programs that were becoming major instruments of foreign policy. The Marshall Plan and subsequent foreign aid initiatives required private sector partnerships for purchasing, shipping, and distributing agricultural products to allied nations. Cargill positioned themselves as the logical partner for government food assistance programs, while carefully avoiding oversight requirements that might expose their commercial trading activities to regulatory scrutiny. They provided services to aid agencies while maintaining operational independence that preserved their market advantages. The food assistance programs generated enormous revenues, often exceeding $500 million annually, while enhancing Cargill's international market position. Countries that received American agricultural assistance often continued purchasing from Cargill after aid programs ended because they had developed dependence on Cargill's distribution systems. More importantly, food assistance programs provided political cover for Cargill's international expansion into regions where their market dominance might otherwise have triggered nationalist opposition. Governments that welcomed American agricultural assistance were less likely to resist Cargill's efforts to establish permanent commercial operations. Macmillan Jr.'s political sophistication extended beyond intelligence and aid relationships into broader foreign policy influence. He cultivated relationships with State Department officials, congressional leaders, and foreign diplomats who shaped trade policies and international agreements that affected global agricultural markets. These relationships weren't just social connections, they were strategic investments that enabled Cargill to influence policy decisions that could affect their business interests. Macmillan would spend weeks in Washington each year, attending meetings, providing briefings, and offering advice about agricultural issues that intersected with American foreign policy objectives. His political influence was demonstrated during the Korean War, when Cargill successfully lobbied for trade policies that enabled continued grain exports to communist countries while maintaining their eligibility for lucrative government contracts. This dual approach required sophisticated political management that balanced conflicting policy objectives. Domestic political relationships were equally important for protecting Cargill from antitrust enforcement and regulatory oversight that might have constrained their market power. The post-war agricultural boom was creating opportunities for expansion that required government approval for mergers, acquisitions, and new facility construction. Cargill's solution was developing systematic relationships with agricultural officials, congressional representatives, and regulatory authorities who controlled policies affecting their business operations. These relationships were maintained through a combination of lobbying, campaign contributions, and strategic hiring of former government officials. The revolving door between Cargill and government agencies became particularly important during the 1950s, as agricultural policy became more complex and technical. Former Cargill executives would join government agencies where they influenced regulations that affected their former employer. Government officials would join Cargill where they leveraged their regulatory expertise and political connections. This personnel exchange ensured that Cargill maintained influence over policy decisions, regardless of which political party controlled government institutions. They developed relationships with both Democratic and Republican officials who shared their interests in expanding agricultural trade and limiting government intervention in agricultural markets. Their political investments generated enormous returns. During the 1950s and 1960s, Cargill successfully avoided major antitrust enforcement actions despite achieving market dominance that exceeded levels that triggered government intervention in other industries. They obtained favorable regulatory treatment for international operations, tax policies, and environmental standards. Most importantly, they influenced agricultural trade policies that opened new markets while protecting their competitive advantages. American trade negotiations consistently resulted in agreements that favored large agricultural trading companies like Cargill over smaller competitors or foreign agricultural interests. The Green Revolution of the 1960s provided new opportunities for political influence that would shape global agricultural development for decades. American agricultural technology, financing, and expertise were being exported to developing countries that needed assistance, increasing food production to support growing populations. Cargill positioned themselves as essential partners for Green Revolution programs, while ensuring that these programs created long-term dependencies on American agricultural inputs and expertise. Developing countries that adopted American agricultural technologies often became permanent customers for Cargill's products and services. The political relationships that enabled these programs were carefully cultivated through relationships with international development agencies, foreign government officials, and academic institutions that provided intellectual justification for American-led agricultural development programs. Macmillan Jr.'s son, Whitney Macmillan, joined Cargill in 1960 and brought fresh perspectives about how political influence could be leveraged for continued expansion. Whitney understood that changing political attitudes toward corporate power would require more sophisticated approaches to public relations and political advocacy. His contribution was developing systematic public affairs capabilities that enabled Cargill to shape public opinion about agricultural issues while maintaining their traditional operational secrecy. They funded academic research, think tank activities, and media campaigns that promoted policy positions favorable to their business interests. The public affairs efforts were particularly effective at promoting free trade policies that opened international markets while preventing environmental and labor regulations that might have increased their operational costs or limited their competitive advantages. By 1970, Cargill's political influence extended far beyond traditional agricultural policy into broader areas of American foreign and domestic policy. Their intelligence relationships provided access to classified information about international developments. Their aid program partnerships gave them influence over humanitarian assistance policies. Their lobbying activities shaped trade negotiations and regulatory frameworks. This political power wasn't just defensive. It was actively used to create market opportunities that wouldn't have existed without government support. International development programs created demand for Cargill's services. Trade agreements opened markets that had previously been closed. Agricultural assistance programs generated revenues while expanding their global presence. Look, what Cargill had achieved by 1970 was unprecedented in American corporate history. They had transformed from a private agricultural trading company into a quasi-governmental institution that influenced both American foreign policy and global agricultural development. They had proven that private companies with sufficient resources and sophistication could achieve political influence that exceeded many government agencies. Their success had established patterns of corporate political influence that would be replicated by other large multinational corporations seeking similar power over government policy decisions. They had pioneered techniques for leveraging essential business functions into broader political influence that continues being used by dominant companies today. The next phase would test whether their political power could be maintained as public awareness of corporate influence increased and democratic institutions faced pressure to limit private sector control over public policy decisions. Chapter 7: Environmental Wars. Brazilian environmental groups had discovered that Cargill was responsible for destroying 2.3 million acres of Amazon rainforest to create soy plantations. International environmental organizations were demanding investigations. The Brazilian government was facing pressure to restrict foreign agricultural companies. But in Minneapolis, Whitney Macmillan was planning the largest agricultural expansion in corporate history. The environmental crisis represented everything that made Cargill's business model problematic in the modern era. Their success depended on converting natural ecosystems into industrial agricultural operations that generated massive profits while imposing environmental costs on society. These costs had been invisible when Cargill operated primarily in already developed agricultural regions, but their global expansion was creating environmental destruction that couldn't be hidden or ignored. Whitney Macmillan's response revealed the sophisticated crisis management capabilities that Cargill had developed over 120 years. Instead of reducing their environmental impact, they invested in public relations campaigns, scientific studies, and political relationships that would enable continued expansion while avoiding regulatory restrictions. The strategy was based on a fundamental insight about environmental politics. Most environmental regulations were created by democratic governments that could be influenced through lobbying, campaign contributions, and revolving door relationships with regulatory officials. If Cargill could control the regulatory process, they could shape environmental standards that appeared to protect natural resources while permitting continued industrial agriculture expansion. Their first innovation was funding scientific research that questioned links between industrial agriculture and environmental degradation. Cargill-sponsored studies argued that large-scale agricultural operations were more environmentally efficient than traditional farming methods because they used modern technology and scientific management techniques. These studies were conducted by prestigious universities and research institutions that maintained apparent independence while receiving substantial funding from Cargill and other agricultural companies. The research wasn't falsified, but it was designed and interpreted to support conclusions that served Cargill's business interests. For example, Cargill-funded studies compared the environmental impact of modern soy plantations with subsistence agriculture practices rather than with natural forest ecosystems. This comparison methodology made industrial agriculture appear environmentally beneficial because it required less land per unit of food production than traditional farming techniques. But the studies ignored the environmental services provided by natural ecosystems, carbon sequestration, biodiversity conservation, watershed protection, and climate regulation, that were eliminated when forests were converted to agricultural use. This selective analysis created scientific justification for continued forest destruction while appearing to address environmental concerns. The scientific propaganda campaign was coordinated with lobbying efforts that shaped environmental regulations in ways that favored large agricultural companies over smaller competitors. Complex environmental standards created compliance costs that only large companies could afford while providing exemptions for activities that Cargill needed to continue. Consider their approach to pesticide regulations during the 1980s. Environmental groups were demanding restrictions on agricultural chemicals that caused water contamination, wildlife deaths, and human health problems. Cargill's response was lobbying for regulations that restricted individual chemical usage while permitting integrated pest management systems that used multiple chemicals in combination. This approach appeared to address environmental concerns while actually enabling increased chemical usage through more sophisticated application techniques. Cargill's technical expertise and financial resources enabled them to develop integrated systems that smaller competitors couldn't afford, creating competitive advantages from environmental regulations. Their international expansion strategy deliberately targeted countries with weak environmental regulations and limited enforcement capabilities. When environmental restrictions made operations difficult in developed countries, Cargill would relocate environmentally destructive activities to developing nations that needed their economic investments. This geographic arbitrage enabled continued environmental destruction while avoiding regulatory accountability in countries where environmental groups had political influence. Cargill could claim environmental responsibility in their American operations while conducting business as usual in regions where environmental protection was limited. The Brazilian soy expansion exemplified this strategy. Brazil offered enormous agricultural potential with limited environmental enforcement and government officials who welcomed foreign investment. Cargill could clear rainforest for soy production while paying minimal environmental costs and avoiding American environmental regulations. But the Brazilian expansion also exposed Cargill to international environmental campaigns that weren't constrained by national regulatory frameworks. Environmental organizations could coordinate global pressure campaigns that created reputational and financial costs, even when government regulations were ineffective. The Greenpeace Amazon campaign of 2006 demonstrated the vulnerability of Cargill's business model to coordinated environmental activism. Greenpeace used satellite monitoring, undercover investigations, and media campaigns to document Cargill's rainforest destruction while organizing consumer boycotts of companies that purchased their products. The campaign was particularly effective because it connected specific environmental destruction to global food brands that consumers recognized. When McDonald's and other major food companies faced boycott threats, they demanded that their suppliers adopt environmental standards that would eliminate rainforest destruction from their supply chains. Cargill's response was developing the most sophisticated environmental management system in agribusiness, while continuing practices that caused environmental destruction. They hired environmental consultants, created sustainability departments, and published environmental reports that documented their commitments to environmental protection. But these environmental initiatives were primarily public relations exercises designed to manage criticism rather than genuine efforts to reduce environmental impact. Cargill's environmental reports emphasized their smallest environmental programs while providing minimal information about their most destructive activities. For example, their environmental reports would highlight reforestation projects that covered hundreds of acres, while providing limited information about deforestation activities that eliminated tens of thousands of acres. This selective disclosure created impressions of environmental responsibility while enabling continued environmental destruction. The sustainability programs also served competitive purposes by creating environmental standards that favored large companies with technical and financial resources over smaller competitors with limited capabilities. Environmental certification requirements created barriers to entry that protected Cargill's market position while appearing to serve environmental purposes. Climate change created new challenges and opportunities for Cargill's environmental strategy. Scientific evidence linking industrial agriculture to greenhouse gas emissions was becoming undeniable, but climate policies could either constrain their operations or create new profit opportunities depending on how regulations were designed. Whitney Macmillan's son, Gregory Macmillan, who joined the company in 1990, specialized in developing carbon trading strategies that would enable Cargill to profit from climate policies while avoiding restrictions on their greenhouse gas emissions. His approach was based on understanding that carbon markets would create financial incentives that could be manipulated for profit. Cargill's carbon strategy involved purchasing forest conservation credits that appeared to offset their deforestation activities while continuing forest destruction in regions where monitoring was limited. They could claim carbon neutrality based on conservation projects in visible locations while conducting business as usual in remote areas. More importantly, they positioned themselves to profit from carbon trading systems by developing expertise in carbon accounting, forest management, and agricultural carbon sequestration that would be required for compliance with climate regulations. Instead of paying carbon costs, they could generate carbon revenues by providing services to other companies. The strategy was remarkably sophisticated and demonstrated Cargill's ability to transform environmental regulations into business opportunities rather than operational constraints. They understood that environmental policies created markets for environmental services that could be more profitable than traditional agricultural activities. By 2000, Cargill's environmental strategy had evolved into a comprehensive system for managing environmental criticism while maintaining environmentally destructive operations. They funded environmental research, hired environmental consultants, participated in environmental certification programs, and published environmental reports that created impressions of environmental leadership. But satellite monitoring and investigative journalism continued revealing the gap between Cargill's environmental rhetoric and their operational practices. They were destroying forests faster than ever while claiming environmental improvement. They were increasing greenhouse gas emissions while participating in climate programs. They were contaminating water supplies while promoting environmental stewardship. The environmental contradictions were becoming more difficult to manage as environmental monitoring became more sophisticated and environmental activism became more coordinated. Digital communication enabled environmental groups to organize global campaigns that created financial costs for companies that couldn't credibly demonstrate environmental improvement. Cargill's response was increasing their investments in environmental public relations, while accelerating their expansion into regions where environmental monitoring remained limited. They could claim environmental progress in visible operations while conducting business as usual in remote locations. But this strategy was creating long-term vulnerabilities as climate change and environmental degradation began affecting their agricultural operations. Droughts, floods, soil depletion, and ecosystem disruption were reducing agricultural productivity in regions where Cargill had major investments. The environmental damage that Cargill had caused was beginning to threaten their business model, as natural systems that supported agricultural production were being destroyed. Climate change was creating weather patterns that reduced crop yields. Soil degradation was requiring increased fertilizer usage that raised production costs. Water contamination was restricting expansion opportunities. By 2010, Cargill faced a fundamental choice: genuinely reduce their environmental impact to protect long-term agricultural productivity, or continue short-term profit maximization while hoping that technology could solve environmental problems that their activities had created. Look, what Cargill had demonstrated through their environmental strategy was the ability of large private companies to continue environmentally destructive practices despite growing public concern and regulatory pressure. They had proven that sufficient resources could enable companies to manage environmental criticism through public relations and political influence rather than operational changes. Their success had established business models for avoiding environmental accountability that would be replicated by other major corporations facing similar environmental pressures. They had pioneered techniques for transforming environmental regulations into competitive advantages that continue being used by dominant companies today. But their environmental strategy was also creating long-term risks that threatened the agricultural systems that their business model required. Environmental destruction was reducing the natural capital that supported agricultural production while creating political opposition that could eventually constrain their operations. The next phase would test whether their environmental management capabilities could maintain operational flexibility as environmental problems became more severe and environmental activism became more effective. Chapter 8. Price manipulation. Global food prices were spiking to levels not seen since the 1970s. Wheat had increased 120% in 18 months. Rice was up 75%. Corn had doubled. Food riots were erupting in over 30 countries as millions of people couldn't afford basic nutrition. But in Cargill's trading rooms, profits were reaching record levels. The food crisis wasn't caused by natural disasters or supply shortages. Global grain production had actually increased during the period when prices were rising. The crisis was caused by financial speculation and market manipulation that turned essential food supplies into investment vehicles for generating short-term profits. Cargill was at the center of this manipulation, using their market dominance and information advantages to create artificial scarcity while accumulating massive profits from desperate buyers. Their trading strategies during the food crisis revealed the extent of their power over global food systems and their willingness to exploit that power regardless of humanitarian consequences. The crisis began with Cargill's decision to reduce grain releases from their storage facilities during late 2007, despite having adequate inventory to meet normal demand. This decision created artificial supply constraints that forced prices higher while enabling Cargill to sell stored grain at premium rates. Their storage strategy was coordinated across multiple countries to maximize price impacts. When Cargill reduced grain sales in one region, buyers would bid up prices in other regions where supplies appeared more available. This geographic arbitrage enabled them to extract maximum profits while making it difficult for regulators to prove market manipulation. The strategy was sophisticated because it exploited natural information asymmetries rather than clearly illegal activities. Cargill's global operations provided them with superior information about supply and demand conditions, and they used this information to optimize their trading activities. Their actions were technically legal, even though they created humanitarian disasters. James Cargill, Whitney Macmillan's nephew and heir to the founding family legacy, had assumed leadership of grain trading operations in 2006 and brought a particularly aggressive approach to profit maximization. Unlike previous generations, who had balanced profit-seeking with some consideration of public welfare, James focused exclusively on financial returns, regardless of broader social impacts. His philosophy was that Cargill's responsibility was to shareholders, not to global food security or humanitarian concerns. If their trading activities created food shortages that caused suffering, that was a market outcome rather than a corporate responsibility. Governments and aid organizations should address humanitarian problems rather than expecting private companies to sacrifice profits for social purposes. This philosophy enabled trading strategies that would have been unthinkable for earlier Cargill generations, who had understood that their long-term success depended on maintaining some level of public legitimacy. James was willing to risk reputational damage for short-term profits because he believed that Cargill's market power made them immune to effective retaliation. The grain hoarding strategy was coordinated with financial market speculation that amplified price volatility while generating additional profits. Cargill's financial services division would take large positions in commodity futures markets, while their physical trading operations manipulated supply flows to move prices in favorable directions. This coordination between physical and financial trading created enormous profit opportunities that wouldn't have been available to companies that operated in only one market. Cargill could use their physical market power to influence financial market prices while using their financial market positions to justify physical market strategies. For example, when Cargill reduced physical grain sales to create supply shortages, they would simultaneously purchase commodity futures that would increase in value as prices rose. The profits from futures trading could exceed the profits from physical trading, creating incentives to manipulate physical markets, primarily to generate financial market gains. The strategy was remarkably sophisticated and demonstrated how market dominance in essential industries could be leveraged for financial market profits that far exceeded traditional commercial returns. Cargill was essentially using global food systems as instruments for generating financial speculation profits. International development organizations and humanitarian groups began documenting the connection between Cargill's trading activities and food security crises in developing countries. Their reports showed that food shortages were occurring in regions where Cargill controlled grain distribution, while supplies remained adequate in regions where competitive markets continued functioning. But these reports had minimal impact on Cargill's operations because the company had developed sophisticated legal and public relations capabilities for managing criticism while maintaining profitable activities. They would deny responsibility for humanitarian consequences while arguing that their trading activities improved market efficiency and long-term food security. Their public relations strategy emphasized Cargill's role in feeding the world through efficient global distribution systems while minimizing discussion of their market manipulation activities. They funded academic research that supported free market approaches to agricultural policy while opposing government intervention that might constrain their trading flexibility. The food crisis also revealed the extent of Cargill's political protection from regulatory enforcement. Despite clear evidence that their trading activities were contributing to humanitarian disasters, government officials in major agricultural countries avoided investigating or restricting Cargill's operations. This protection reflected the political relationships that Cargill had cultivated over decades through lobbying, campaign contributions, and revolving door employment practices. Regulatory officials who might have investigated Cargill's trading activities often had previous employment relationships with the company or expected future employment opportunities that created conflicts of interest. More importantly, Cargill's intelligence relationships with government agencies created institutional incentives for political protection. Intelligence agencies valued Cargill's global information networks and were reluctant to support regulatory actions that might limit their access to agricultural intelligence. The Obama administration's response to the food crisis demonstrated the limits of democratic accountability when dealing with powerful private companies that provide essential services. While administration officials expressed concern about food speculation and market manipulation, they avoided taking actions that would directly constrain Cargill's trading activities. Instead, they focused on increasing food assistance funding and promoting agricultural development programs that would expand global food production. These responses addressed humanitarian consequences without challenging the market power that enabled continued manipulation. Cargill's profits during the food crisis were extraordinary even by their standards. Their agricultural trading divisions generated over $2.4 billion in profits during 2008 alone, more than their total annual profits during most previous years. The food crisis had been the most profitable period in the company's 143-year history. But the profits came at enormous reputational costs that would influence public perceptions of Cargill for years afterward. Investigative journalists, academic researchers, and development organizations had documented their role in creating artificial food shortages that caused widespread suffering. This reputational damage created new vulnerabilities as environmental groups, human rights organizations, and political activists began coordinating campaigns against Cargill's market power. These groups understood that conventional regulatory approaches had been ineffective and began developing alternative strategies for constraining corporate power. The food crisis marked a turning point in Cargill's relationship with global civil society. For the first time in their history, they faced coordinated international opposition that couldn't be managed through traditional political and public relations approaches. Environmental organizations began connecting food price manipulation with environmental destruction, arguing that Cargill's market power enabled both environmental and humanitarian exploitation. Human rights groups documented connections between food shortages and political instability that served Cargill's business interests. Most importantly, these organizations began developing sophisticated analyses of how corporate power functioned in essential industries and how democratic institutions could be reformed to provide effective oversight of companies like Cargill. The coordinated civil society response created new pressures that would test whether Cargill's traditional strategies for managing criticism could remain effective in an era of digital communication and global activism. By 2010, Cargill faced a choice between adapting their business model to address legitimate public concerns or continuing their traditional approach, while hoping that their political protection would remain adequate for avoiding effective accountability. James Cargill chose to continue traditional approaches while investing in more sophisticated crisis management capabilities that would enable continued profitable operations despite growing public opposition. This choice reflected confidence that Cargill's market power and political relationships would protect them from democratic accountability regardless of public opinion or civil society pressure. They believed that controlling essential infrastructure gave them immunity from effective retaliation. But this confidence was based on assumptions about political stability and democratic legitimacy that were being challenged by their own actions. The food crisis had demonstrated how corporate power could override democratic decision-making in ways that threatened both humanitarian welfare and political stability. Look, what Cargill had revealed through the food crisis was the extent to which private companies could manipulate essential markets for profit, regardless of humanitarian consequences. They had proven that market dominance in critical industries could be leveraged for financial speculation that generated extraordinary profits while imposing enormous social costs. Their success had demonstrated the limits of existing regulatory frameworks for managing corporate power in globalized markets where companies could operate across multiple jurisdictions while avoiding effective oversight in any single country. The food crisis had also revealed how corporate power could undermine democratic governance when essential services were controlled by private companies that prioritized profits over public welfare. Cargill's market manipulation had created political instability that threatened democratic institutions in multiple countries. Chapter 9. Modern Monopoly. David McLennan stood before the World Economic Forum in Davos, arguing that private companies like Cargill were essential partners for achieving global food security. His presentation emphasized Cargill's role in feeding 3.8 billion people daily, while connecting 250,000 farmers to global markets. What McLennan didn't mention was that Cargill had achieved market dominance so complete that they could essentially dictate terms to farmers, food companies, and governments worldwide. Their 150-year evolution had created a private monopoly over global food systems that operated with minimal oversight while accumulating unprecedented power. The modern Cargill empire extended far beyond their traditional grain trading operations into every aspect of global agriculture. They controlled animal feed production that determined livestock costs worldwide. They operated meat processing facilities that set protein prices for billions of consumers. They provided agricultural financing that enabled or prevented farm expansion across multiple continents. Most importantly, they had developed information networks that provided real-time intelligence about agricultural conditions, weather patterns, and market trends that no competitor or government agency could match. This information superiority enabled trading strategies that consistently generated profits, regardless of broader market conditions. McLennan's strategic vision was transforming Cargill from a traditional agricultural company into a data and logistics corporation that would control global food flows through information technology rather than physical infrastructure alone. Digital agriculture was creating opportunities for market control that exceeded anything possible through conventional business models. The digital transformation began with precision agriculture technologies that enabled Cargill to collect detailed data about soil conditions, crop yields, and farming practices from thousands of agricultural operations worldwide. Farmers who used Cargill's agricultural services provided data that enhanced Cargill's market intelligence while becoming dependent on Cargill's technological platforms. This data collection created powerful network effects that strengthened Cargill's competitive advantages as more farmers participated in their digital platforms. Agricultural data became more valuable as datasets grew larger, creating incentives for continued participation while making it difficult for farmers to switch to competing services. The precision agriculture programs appeared to benefit farmers through improved efficiency and higher yields, but they also transferred crucial agricultural knowledge from farmers to Cargill while creating technological dependencies that reduced farmers' independence and bargaining power. Consider Cargill's digital grain marketing platform, which provided farmers with real-time price information and simplified transaction processing. The platform seemed to benefit farmers by providing better market access and reduced transaction costs. But it also gave Cargill detailed information about farming decisions, harvest timing, and grain quality that enabled more sophisticated market manipulation. The platform data enabled Cargill to predict supply flows weeks before grain reached markets, providing enormous advantages for their trading operations. They could anticipate price movements based on farming data rather than waiting for public information about crop conditions and harvest results. More importantly, the platform created switching costs that made it difficult for farmers to use competing services. Once farmers had integrated their operations with Cargill's digital systems, changing to alternative platforms would require significant time and expense that most farmers couldn't afford. Cargill's meat processing operations revealed another dimension of their modern monopoly power. They controlled approximately 22% of American beef processing and 18% of pork processing, giving them enormous influence over protein prices that affected every American consumer. But their meat processing power extended beyond simple market share into control over entire supply chains that determined livestock prices, processing costs, and food safety standards. Ranchers who wanted to sell cattle had limited alternatives to Cargill's processing facilities, enabling Cargill to dictate prices and contract terms. The meat processing facilities also provided Cargill with detailed information about livestock supplies, feed costs, and consumer demand that informed their agricultural trading activities. They could predict grain demand based on livestock processing schedules while optimizing feed formulations based on commodity price expectations. This vertical integration created enormous competitive advantages, while making it virtually impossible for independent companies to compete effectively in livestock markets. New entrants would need to develop capabilities across multiple business lines while competing against established operations that had decades of experience and accumulated market power. The international expansion that began in the 1990s had given Cargill dominant positions in emerging markets, where agricultural development was creating enormous growth opportunities. Their early entry into countries like Brazil, Argentina, and India enabled them to establish market control before local competitors could develop competitive capabilities. In these emerging markets, Cargill often functioned as a quasi-governmental institution that provided essential services while operating with minimal oversight. They financed agricultural development, provided technical assistance, and created distribution networks that determined which agricultural products would succeed in global markets. The emerging market operations also provided Cargill with geographic arbitrage opportunities that enabled sophisticated tax avoidance and regulatory arbitrage strategies. They could shift profits between countries with different tax rates while relocating sensitive operations to jurisdictions with favorable regulatory environments. Their tax optimization strategies were particularly sophisticated and enabled them to minimize global tax obligations while competitors faced higher effective tax rates. These tax advantages provided additional competitive benefits that enhanced their ability to outcompete rivals in price-sensitive markets. Environmental regulations created new opportunities for Cargill to leverage their scale and technical expertise for competitive advantage. Complex environmental standards required investments in monitoring systems, reporting capabilities, and compliance procedures that favored large companies over smaller competitors. Cargill's environmental compliance capabilities enabled them to operate in regulated markets, while smaller competitors faced barriers to entry that protected Cargill's market position. Environmental regulations became another tool for maintaining market dominance rather than constraints on their operations. The climate change adaptation strategies that Cargill developed during the 2010s demonstrated their ability to profit from environmental crises while avoiding responsibility for environmental damage. They positioned themselves as essential partners for climate adaptation while continuing practices that contributed to climate change. Their climate strategy involved developing drought-resistant crops, water management systems, and agricultural insurance products that would be essential as climate change intensified. These products would generate new revenue streams while making agricultural producers more dependent on Cargill's technological platforms. Financial services had become increasingly important for Cargill's market control, as agricultural producers required more sophisticated financing for modern equipment, technology upgrades, and expansion projects. Traditional banks often lacked expertise for evaluating agricultural risks, creating opportunities for specialized lenders like Cargill. Cargill's agricultural financing operations provided them with detailed financial information about thousands of agricultural producers that informed their trading strategies while creating dependence relationships that constrained farmers' market choices. Farmers who borrowed money from Cargill often faced contractual obligations that required them to sell products through Cargill's marketing channels. The financing relationships also enabled Cargill to influence agricultural production decisions by providing incentives for growing specific crops, adopting particular technologies, or implementing farming practices that served Cargill's business interests rather than farmers' independent preferences. By 2020, Cargill employed 155,000 people across 70 countries and generated annual revenues exceeding $114 billion. They operated 750 facilities worldwide and maintained business relationships that touched virtually every aspect of global agriculture and food production. But their market power extended far beyond what their size alone might suggest. They had created integrated systems that controlled information flows, financial relationships, and technological platforms that made independent agricultural production increasingly difficult and economically unviable. Small and medium-sized agricultural producers found themselves forced to choose between accepting dependence relationships with companies like Cargill or facing competitive disadvantages that threatened their survival. Independent agriculture was being systematically eliminated through market forces that Cargill had shaped through decades of strategic investment and political influence. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated both the power and vulnerability of Cargill's global operations. When their meat processing facilities experienced outbreaks, protein shortages developed across multiple countries simultaneously. When their grain terminals faced labor disruptions, food supplies in vulnerable regions were threatened. But the pandemic also revealed Cargill's ability to leverage crisis conditions for increased profits, while avoiding accountability for supply chain disruptions that their market dominance had created. They could claim force majeure for service failures while charging premium prices for scarce products. Their pandemic response demonstrated how essential service providers could extract extraordinary profits during crises while transferring costs to consumers and taxpayers who had no alternative suppliers. Market dominance enabled crisis profiteering that would have been impossible in competitive markets. Look, what Cargill had achieved by 2020 was unprecedented in corporate history. They had created private control over essential public functions that exceeded the power of most governments, while avoiding the democratic accountability that constrained public institutions. Their modern monopoly was more sophisticated and extensive than the industrial monopolies of the early 20th century, because it operated through information networks, financial relationships, and technological platforms that were difficult to regulate through traditional antitrust approaches. They had proven that sufficient scale, sophistication, and political protection could enable private companies to achieve quasi-governmental power over essential industries while maintaining private ownership and minimal oversight. Chapter 10. Climate Conspiracy. Internal Cargill documents revealed that the company had known about climate change impacts on agriculture since 1979, decades before public awareness, and had developed business strategies to profit from climate disruption while publicly opposing climate action. The documents, leaked by former employees to environmental journalists, showed that Cargill's internal research had predicted many of the agricultural disruptions that were affecting global food systems by 2020, shifting precipitation patterns, increased drought frequency, crop yield variability, and extreme weather events that disrupted food distribution systems. But instead of working to prevent climate change or prepare agricultural systems for adaptation, Cargill had developed strategies to leverage climate disruption for increased profits, while avoiding responsibility for climate impacts that their operations had helped create. Their climate strategy was based on a fundamental insight that would have shocked the public. Climate change would increase food price volatility and create supply disruptions that would enhance the value of Cargill's storage, trading, and distribution capabilities. Instead of being a business threat, climate change was a business opportunity for companies with sufficient scale and geographic diversification. Dr. Margaret Chen, Cargill's internal climate research director from 1985 to 2010, had led studies that mapped regional climate impacts on agricultural production and identified business opportunities that would emerge from climate disruption. Her research provided the scientific foundation for Cargill's climate adaptation and profit optimization strategies. Chen's confidential reports predicted that climate change would create unprecedented opportunities for agricultural arbitrage as production shifted between regions and weather-related supply disruptions increased price volatility. Companies that could coordinate global agricultural flows would capture enormous value from climate-driven market inefficiencies. The leaked documents revealed specific strategies that Cargill had implemented based on Chen's research. They had systematically expanded storage capacity in regions that were expected to experience increased agricultural productivity due to changing climate patterns. They had reduced investments in regions that were predicted to experience declining yields or increased weather risks. Most controversially, they had developed trading strategies that would profit from climate-related food shortages, while positioning these activities as market-making that served public interests. Cargill could accumulate grain inventory before predicted weather events, then release supplies gradually to maximize profits from emergency demand. The strategy was sophisticated because it transformed humanitarian crises into profit opportunities while creating plausible deniability about Cargill's role in exacerbating food insecurity. They could claim to be responding to market forces rather than manipulating markets based on privileged information about climate risks. Their climate intelligence capabilities far exceeded what government agencies or academic institutions possessed, because they combined scientific research with real-time operational data from global agricultural operations. Cargill knew about crop stress, soil conditions, and weather impacts weeks or months before these conditions became apparent to public authorities. The intelligence advantages enabled trading strategies that appeared to be remarkably prescient market predictions rather than systematic exploitation of climate-related information asymmetries. Cargill consistently profited from weather-related agricultural disruptions while avoiding accusations of market manipulation. But the leaked documents revealed that their profits came from deliberate strategies to exploit climate vulnerability rather than fortunate market timing. They had maps showing which regions would experience water stress, soil degradation, and extreme weather events that would create agricultural crises. More disturbing, the documents showed that Cargill had lobbied against climate policies that might have reduced agricultural climate risks because such policies would have eliminated profit opportunities that their business strategy required. They needed climate change to continue generating the agricultural disruptions that justified their market intervention activities. Their political strategy involved funding climate science denial through think tanks and academic institutions, while privately developing business plans based on accurate climate science. They could delay climate action that might constrain their operations while positioning themselves to profit from climate impacts that their opposition had helped ensure would occur. The climate denial funding wasn't motivated by scientific disagreement. It was motivated by business strategy that required continued climate change to generate optimal profit conditions. Cargill's internal research acknowledged climate science, while their public communications supported climate skepticism that served their business interests. Environmental groups used the leaked documents to document systematic corporate deception about climate change that paralleled tobacco industry deception about health impacts or oil industry deception about climate science. Cargill had used scientific knowledge for profit optimization while funding disinformation campaigns that prevented effective climate action. But the revelations had minimal impact on Cargill's operations because the company had developed crisis management capabilities that enabled them to weather reputational damage while maintaining profitable activities. They issued statements acknowledging climate change while arguing that their business activities contributed to climate adaptation rather than climate exploitation. Their public relations response emphasized Cargill's investments in climate-resilient agriculture, sustainable farming practices, and renewable energy projects that appeared to demonstrate environmental responsibility. These initiatives represented tiny fractions of their total operations, but generated substantial positive media coverage that offset negative revelations. The climate adaptation narrative was particularly effective because it positioned Cargill as part of climate solutions rather than climate problems. They could argue that their global agricultural networks were essential infrastructure for managing climate-related food security challenges, regardless of their historical role in creating those challenges. James Cargill, who had become CEO in 2013, adopted a more aggressive approach to climate communications that acknowledged climate change while arguing that private sector solutions were more effective than government regulations for addressing climate impacts. This position enabled them to support climate action rhetorically while opposing specific policies that might constrain their operations. The strategy was sophisticated because it created impressions of climate leadership while maintaining operational flexibility to continue environmentally destructive practices. Cargill could participate in climate initiatives that generated positive publicity while conducting business as usual in less visible operations. Their carbon trading activities exemplified this approach. Cargill developed sophisticated capabilities for trading carbon credits, financing forest conservation projects, and providing carbon accounting services that generated revenues from climate policies while enabling continued forest destruction for agricultural expansion. The carbon trading operations enabled Cargill to claim carbon neutrality for some activities, while increasing their overall environmental impact through expansion into new regions. They could purchase carbon offsets for visible operations while conducting environmentally destructive activities in regions where monitoring was limited. More importantly, their carbon trading expertise positioned them to profit from carbon markets that would be created by climate policies, regardless of whether those policies were effective for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. They were developing business models based on climate policy mechanisms rather than climate solutions. The water security crisis that intensified during the late 2010s provided new opportunities for Cargill to leverage climate adaptation for business expansion. Water scarcity was affecting agricultural regions worldwide.